Our office acts as a watchdog over New York's elected officials, its leaders, and agencies. And there are clearly areas of both our city and state operations that are in need of structural changes, enhanced oversight, and increased transparency and accountability. It is critical to increase the transparency of these processes and the accessibility that New Yorkers have with their government, particularly when some leaders are transparently trying right now to prevent access. COPIC, which my office chairs, presents a pretty good opportunity to better connect the government to the people, whether through improving public hearings or expanding accessibility of government resources. We need to use all of the tools available to us, not only to serve in our watchdog capacity, but to empower New Yorkers to organize and enact equitable change. Open data is a critical tool in this area. It puts information and power in the hands of the people. And we have an opportunity now in government to use technology and innovation to meet the issues facing New Yorkers in new ways. My office is committed to helping make sure that the people most affected by those problems are most central to their solutions, and open data is a key tool in ensuring that equity and inclusion are prioritized in these processes of government innovation. We don't want to go back to normal before the pandemic, because normal actually, it didn't work in many areas. This is definitely one of them. It was pretty horrible. So we need to go better. We need to go back to better than normal, something new. Thanks to the work of John and Mudit and others, our office has taken on an entirely new approach to data usage and publication. Nowhere is that more clear than in our worst landlords watch list, which I know is going to be discussed even further. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, my office has been pushing for greater transparency in data, whether on infections, testing, vaccinations, or enforcement of social distancing protocols. The public has a right to access this kind of information, and the government has the opportunity to facilitate that connection and strengthen the public's voice. I think we're in a unique time coming off of all those things, that the public is attuned in a way that may not have been for some time about why these things are needed to be more transparent and accessible. So we really have to grab onto that to that time period so we don't lose it. Thank you, BetaNYC, for helping put on this week of community-driven events around open data, hashtag open data, and just for all the work you've been doing on this for such a long time. I know Judith, John, and Mudit have an in-depth and fascinating conversation ahead. Thank them again for helping put this together. So again, I just want to thank everybody, and I know we're about to hear some good stuff. So peace and blessings, love and light to you all.
All righty, thank you so much. This session is the Open Data Keys for Equitable Innovation with our office, the Public Advocate, with the Public Advocate Jumaane D. And I'm John Katt. I'm the Director of Technology, Development, and Data here for the Office of the Public Advocate, and I'm joined by my colleague Mudit, who will introduce himself shortly as we get into the presentation. So I want to go quickly into some highlights around, not 100% sure where everyone's at on what the Public Advocate's Office is, but I want to draw out some of the areas, the key areas that our office serves our constituents here in New York City, and the ways in which open data specifically empowers and enables those actions of our office to better serve New Yorkers and add that layer of transparency and accountability that you hear so often being mentioned with open data. And so, as the Public Advocate mentioned in his remarks, the Public Advocate's Office is the watchdog of New York City. And what that means is a variety of things, but one of the charter listed mandates is to monitor the operation of the public information and service complaint programs across agencies and entities in New York City government, to monitor them for functionality, monitor them for usability, monitor them to ensure that constituents, as they engage with those services, they're receiving the services that the city is promising, but also receiving them in a way that is best served in an equitable and inclusive manner. And so open data is a really vital tool in allowing us to monitor all of the different public service and complaint programs across the city. And when before this law came into effect, way back when, thanks to the hard work of BetaNYC, the task of monitoring these systems and services involved a lot of groundwork. It involved a lot of key investigation and a lot of going case by case with constituents, and did not allow us the more holistic views that open data many times allows us to do, where we see a lot of our citywide policy recommendations are in large part culminations of being able to analyze and utilize open data across the spectrum. And we're going to get into a little bit specifically which open data resources we use and their power, but I will say it is not limited to just one area of open data. While a lot of front-facing things have to do with housing and education and open data, and now with COVID health, there are many more operational components of open data that really empower the work of Public Advocate and the office. As Public Advocate is the watchdog of the city, the monitoring is portion number one that our office has to go into, but the making recommendations is also where open data allows us to, in those recommendations, add a layer of accountability to where these services many times fall short or just need fine-tuning. And so through the publication of our reports and our annual progress report, we're able to, with open data, weed out and add those transparent, accountable to the public reports that allow them to see areas that we've worked with agencies and entities across the city to improve the services for end New Yorkers. And finally, the Public Advocate, as the advocate for all New Yorkers, open data finally leads to, and we've seen snowball in more recent years, a really powerful tool for organizing New Yorkers around movements that we see as necessary and the community really sees as necessary to push New York City forward. And so open data as an organizing tool, it really allows constituents the ability to understand through partnerships with our office and advocacy organizations, the ability to understand the inner workings of city government and then understand where those inner workings and policies and laws and services need updates and need fine-tuning in future advocacy and organizing movement. And last week, our office held an all-day virtual conference called State of the People. And we had an innovation session during that conference where we looked at the ways in which our office is working on, and in collaboration with different partners across the city, such as BetaNYC, looking at the ways in which innovation specifically is a tool and process and method of thinking that is more important now as we look towards the future of rebuilding a New York City for all New Yorkers. We, in that session, touched on innovation, technology, and the necessity of public discourse. And we're now today talking during Open Data Week, where does open data play a key role in empowering those items that we mentioned that last week around equitable information? Where does open data play a key role in facilitating that many times, but also being a driving force to empower its movement, organizing, and inaction? And so just to quickly recap for those who weren't able to join our session last week, for innovation, we as an office see that as a mindset and a process of equitable problem solving for and by communities, and really centering the community in the process by which the city and advocacy groups look to implement solutions across the host of issues. And this looks different in a lot of different applications. One more recent one would be the rollout of a vaccine website, and where if the community had been centered in the process of designing and implementing that solution, we would have had the necessary accessibility and the necessary design implemented into that solution so that the communities most at risk and most at need would have been able to take advantage of that technology and piece of innovation. When we don't see that go as it should, we see technology many times just rolled out and thrown, for lack of a better word, at a community, when if you had just involved the design thinkers and the community participants and done basic user testing from the get-go, in that innovation process, we consider even small things as such as website building as innovative processes. If the community had been centered in that process, we would have been able to avoid a lot of the hiccups and pain and real life harm that can result from just rolling out specific innovative solutions. Open data, where does that play a role in this innovation process? And we see that continually over the past couple of years specifically, where open data is now shedding light on specific pockets and service areas around the city that the community knew all along. Open data is now allowing even further organizing in those areas and allows our office to collaborate on an even plane and even understanding with communities centered around the data and its analysis to be able to effectively come with powerful solutions that we are able to then make policy recommendations to the city and its counterparts, but also pieces of legislation when it's called for. Moving from innovation, quickly touching on technology, we talk about technology here and where does open data play a role in the advocacy for technology, both hardware and software. We all know government is becoming increasingly digital and tech powered. Open data is, in our view and the view of our community partners, a pillar in any implementation of a technology solution, both hardware and software. It adds insight into the operations of how that piece of technology is actually serving its community. And it adds the necessity of showcasing where those technologies are helping or hampering equity. And this is why our office has been such a proponent for pushing for the equity numbers around COVID vaccine distribution and testing and outreach and engagement, because open data in those areas, when provided and when succinct, offer the ability for our office to advocate for policy changes or system changes to further the story of equity and the necessity of equity in government services that we all know everybody wants. And so open data just allows our office to effectively move in this space more so than it ever has. And finally, public discourse. We see this as a vital component in equitable innovation process, in an equitable and inclusive technology implementation process, but more so looking into the future. We really see, again, centering the community and highlighting their stories and their narratives in public discourse as the ability to be able to wrong the mistakes of the past and be purposeful in our implementation of the solutions of the future. And so we see open data as not like transparency is one of the things that open data allows there, but more importantly, open data many times fosters that conversation and fosters that necessity of involvement from the community more so than just the pain point itself. And so we really see open data as an important component in all three of these: innovation, technology, and public discourse areas. With that being said, I want to dive into a little bit specifically about open data project that our office works on year in and year out, and that would be our landlord watch list. The landlord watch list started under our now current mayor and former public advocate, Bill de Blasio, back in, I always get this wrong, it's either 2010 or 2011. But up on the slide right now, we have what was the first iteration of the landlord watch list. During the time, open data was in its infancy, and accountability about landlords' actions and misactions in buildings was hard to pin down. And with the birth of this list, we were able to see through data where the most egregious acting landlords resided in the city, what buildings they were touching in, what communities were most facing the brunt of that mismanagement by these landlords. And so we saw the birth of this list that really has now snowballed into what we have now, 10 or so years into this list, which is a robust data tool for constituents, for advocacy groups, for lawmakers, for landlords themselves, for those who have to interact with landlords such as management companies or banking institutions. This list has really, obviously, is only in existence because we have robust and transparent open data, but is also in existence because this office has really focused on being able to provide a tool that takes what can be somewhat hard to understand different data sets and different misnomers and how agencies treat violations or landlords, and consolidating that and concising it into a list that constituents can use to hold their landlords accountable. This is just these are just current slides of what the current watch list looks like. Next slide, we're kind of looking at the world that makes the watch list. And I'll admit I had a little bit of fun kind of trying to craft what this slide looks like, but the story behind this list is not just a download of violations and then sorting by, who has the most violations and then publishing a list. There's a lot that goes into the creation of this list, from, identifying buildings across agencies. So Housing Preservation and Development, the housing agency in the city, HPD, identifies a building one way through building ID. DOB uses BIN. How do you traverse that? Identifying specific landlords through all the different registration data sets that are in the city is another mountain that you have to tackle. What do these things like head officer and individual owner mean in relation to the ownership of a building? Where does the management agent come in? What is a violation class, A through C, and then I? How do you decipher that? These are a lot of things that have to, and this office has painstakingly gone through to ensure that on the watch list, which my colleague will walk through shortly, on that actual list, you're able to understand what the data means in a way that you're going to then be able to take action off of it, and not just say, oh, this is number one, I may or may not know them, and walk away, but really emphasizing the need to take action and organize to hold these landlords accountable continually, and then also hold the city accountable for better holding the maintenance code of the city accountable, and trying to instill policies that will ensure that the most egregious cases of these landlords are prevented in the future. And so everything that we see on this screen is a culmination of shortly, not entirety, of the different data sets that our office compiles, and then publishes the end list every year at the end of the year. With that being said, I think now is probably a pertinent time to actually go through this watch list and see what it looks like in the different use cases that our constituents use this list for. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Mudit.
Just a little background for our design for the landlord watch list. We try to be conscious of making it more accessible. As John has already shown what it used to look like 10 years ago, you can see there was like going through a straight CSV file, and to what we have right now is to be using the most data visualization and to make it more accessible for the constituents. When you first land on the website, you would see we made the search feature available as a first tool. So when constituents land on it, they can look it up if my landlord is on the worst landlord or not. What you can do is, in order to utilize this feature, all you have to do is look up your building. So for example, say I'll use a building that's on the watch list. We're using geofencing for the addresses, and once you see the address in autofill, you can click on it, and then it takes you to a different page which lists the name of the landlord if he or she is on the watch list, and then it provides you with a lot of other information that is difficult to get from the open data portal. As you can see, this building is under Abdul Khan. He's on our worst landlord watch list. He's been on our watch list for a couple of years now. And then we list out a lot of other data information, like every number of open HPD violations, how many buildings does the landlord have, and so forth. So I'll go back to our home, and in order to keep in mind to make it more accessible and to get our point across to the constituents and to everyone in New York City, we've also used data visualization. As you can see, we've used data mapping to show the number of buildings on the worst landlord watch list in correlation to where the areas most impacted by COVID-19. One of the examples, you can see majority of the worst landlord buildings are located in the area of Bronx, which has been most impacted by COVID-19. Going down on it, then the third section provides us a platform for people to share their stories. Nothing is more powerful than giving people a platform so they can tell their stories, share their voice. We have a couple of stories highlighted on our website where you can see and hear everyone's story on their point of view, the buildings they've been living in, how it has affected them, what the landlords are doing in order to make sure that's not happening. Then we will go on the landlord page. Just a brief overview, again, just to make sure we're making the website most accessible to every constituent in order to make it easier for everything to read. We've used the tools provided by technology to us to showcase the most important points. As you can see, the first thing we have highlighted, the number of buildings. We had like 476 buildings listed on the worst landlord watch list this year. And all of those buildings averaged out to 50,733 violations, which is quite a big number for 76 buildings. The second thing we've listed out is immediately hazardous violations, which is Class C violations as the terminology used by the Housing Preservation of the Department, HPD. As you can see, the buildings which ended up on the watch list averaged out to be 2.5 violations per unit as compared to 0.2 violations per unit on the citywide buildings, which would lead us to a magnitude of like more than 10% on these buildings, which is quite a big number if you look at it from the data view. The next section for the landlord page is where the bulk of the watch list lives. To make it more different and to differentiate and make it as one CSV that reads from top to bottom, we've tried to make the design so it's easier for constituents when they land on this page to consume this information and find only the information they need and to accommodate every type of person. So the first thing you would see on this page is how you would, if you can search your building to see if your building ended up on the watch list or not. And then we also have another feature where you can, if you want to filter it down, you can choose from different landlords. If you don't want to go through all the landlords, you can scroll down, find the landlord and click on it as well. And it will take you to that specific landlord as well. The third part of this section is something we've already seen when we do the search feature. In order to lay out everything, all the information, you can see the landlord name. The first landlord who ended up on the list was Jason Korn, and then the number of buildings he owned, as well number of DOB violations, average number of HPD violations, etc. And on the bottom part, we included all the buildings that ended up on the watch list owned by Jason Korn. And then you can scroll through it by using these arrows and find different buildings owned by him. And moving on to the next section, we have the about page is like where we break down all the process, what's the description, what the watch list is all about, methodology, if you are intrigued by how we make the list, learn about it, and you can click on the methodology, learn everything in detail, how the list is made, what we have been using to make this list as well. And again, keeping in mind to accommodate all type of people, all constituents, we have also linked another section where if you want to look at the traditional view, you can click on it and see all the landlords listed in one view where you can scroll down as like a list, or where you can scroll down and take a look at it. Same thing with the buildings, you can click on the buildings as well and you can see all the buildings that's been on the watch list. Then moving on, the next page we have on the watch list is the map. Again, using as much data visualization as possible, we have tried to point it out. Worst landlord watch list buildings are located in the lower income areas. As you can see, for the same part, like same thing, Bronx, we have income less than 10,000 or 10,000, 20,000, and we can see a lot of red dots. All these red dots are in buildings that have been on the worst landlord watch list for this year. And you can scroll through, you can zoom out, then you can hover over each point, and then you can get the information base related to that building as well. As you can see on the right side, we have different features as well. The second features include the minority demographic, how most of the worst landlord watch list building ended up where the most percentage of minority groups have been living. Majority of it ended up in Bronx, Brooklyn, but then again, at the same time, there were some buildings that ended up on lower Manhattan, where the percentage was a little lower for lower minority people. Third section is the same as we've seen on the homepage, the COVID-19 section, which we have demonstrated as well already. If you're interested to know where we gathered the data and wanted to make something of your own, again, this is all open data. You can scroll down and then you can see all the data resources listed below on our website as well. The last thing on our website we have is the boroughs page. This page wasn't included on the first iteration of the watch list. So again, taking the feedback from people, and in order to accommodate and get the information to all the constituents, we made a page for boroughs, which highlights all the buildings which might have not ended up on the worst landlord watch list, since their landlord doesn't own a lot of buildings. So their score wasn't high enough to end on the worst landlord watch list. But again, at the same time, their buildings are still impacting a lot of constituents and are in bad in a lot of ways. So in order to highlight that, we've broken it down by boroughs as well. You can scroll down and then you can see the top 10 watch list buildings in each borough. Again, clicking on the arrows to go through each building as well. And at this point, I would throw it back to John to go over the rest of the presentation as well.
All righty, thank you, Mudit. So before I go back, I just want to highlight a couple of things that Mudit had been bringing up in the presentation of the website is that a lot of what we've tried to focus the design of the website over the years has been where are our constituents, where are New Yorkers going to this and using it in organizing, in holding landlords accountable, and pushing for change. And a lot of that has been story driven. And so where you saw on the website, including video testimonials of tenants living currently in the buildings listed on the watch list, goes a long way to connecting to what do the numbers mean. Like, we've done all of this work to compile numbers about how many C violations a certain landlord has across a number of their buildings. What does that actually mean? And we can showcase that in the data. You know, a Class C violation is immediately hazardous. And so things like hot water or no heat or lead are indicative of a Class C violation. What does it look like for someone to have to live with that as a systemic part of their residence? So these are not just numbers. There are stories behind these numbers, and that is one of the more impactful uses of this list, is being able to highlight those stories, and then by highlighting those stories, galvanize the organization and movement building behind coalitions that will push for the necessary change to hold these landlords accountable and have the city do more to enforce the housing maintenance code here in the city. So as Mudit went through the list, hopefully you're able to see a lot of where these different data sets start to play into what builds a landlord watch list. I'm sure there's a lot more that both he and I can say over the past, I don't even know how many years it's been, being able to get to the point where we can group landlords together, group violations, and build this list. But I won't bore anyone further with this list. Moving with this example of one of the more impactful tools that our office builds using open data, we're now more than ever, as again, the public advocate mentioned at the opening of the session, looking to the inclusion of equitable and inclusive innovation processes and as a key role of advocacy. And we see that as a key role of advocacy in making sure that we're supposed to be the voice of our constituents. How best can we be their voice? What tool sets do we have to our availability and disposal to be able to make the change necessary and push the specific piece of legislation or policy change? And equitable and inclusive innovation is one of those tools that our office will be more and more using in the future in our advocacy work. And so with that being said, we have some more to say about, what does the future of our office it look like in hearing those stories about innovation and inclusivity and equity when it comes to innovation. But I'd really be interested now to kind of turn it over to those in the audience and those tuning in to see what your thoughts on the innovation and technology space are.
Where do you see examples of transparency in #GovTech?
When we're talking about transparency in GovTech, this is more than just the government being forthcoming about the technology that they're using to solve a specific problem. In my mind, and in a lot of the work that we engage with, transparency in GovTech has a lot more to do with how did you get to the point of deciding that this piece of technology was the correct solution for the problem that XYZ community is trying to solve. And so there's a lot of conversation and a lot of thought that does go into the picking of these specific technologies, or even if it's an in-house piece of technology that's built, there is a lot of thought that is talked about, a lot of user feedback that is considered. Being transparent about what went into that decision can go a long way to adding transparency and understanding from the constituent side. When they come to our office and talk about a specific service, if they were given the necessary pieces of information, many times it's just how do they navigate a piece of technology. So for example, if a constituent comes to us and doesn't understand the benefits portal for a given agency, if that technology had been more transparent and more inclusive in its development process, and this is just for example, then the constituent would have a resource or a operational complaint system at that agency that they'd be able to walk through on their demographic specific level to understand the service that they were trying to receive. But too often it's not built in that way. And then the constituent ends up in our office. And then it's a pretty simple conversation from there, because we deal with this in a daily basis, where we're able to then basically serve as that transparency tool to the constituent, that there's just a much more efficient way to go about that. I don't know, Mudit, if you had anything specifically that you wanted to add on to that.
No, I just want to say I completely agree with what you've said. I would say we're in the very first steps of making this like transparent in all the government technology. So there are like still some area that's not covered, because some constituents who don't like completely understand how everything is working out, which leads to a question that it should be easily accessible to the people, that there is like easily understandable. So I think we're definitely like in the first steps of this like transparency. So.
Gotcha. I would agree with that. And I think there's an interesting component here. And I saw one of the responses to examples of transparency is like, what is GovTech specifically? And I resonate with that a lot, because throughout my current career here in government, it's too many times there's an inner circle in the GovTech and the CivTech space that knows the jargon, that knows the decision makers, that knows the specific technologies and the vendors. And it really does not lend to being able to port to the constituent, and so that they understand what even a GovTech conversation would be. So GovTech is broad. GovTech, when we say GovTech, we're talking about everything from the website that you go to pay a parking ticket, to signing up for a vaccine, to, the GovTech is that Link NYC Wi-Fi silos that you see all across the city. Like GovTech is increasingly becoming an integral part in all services that you have to engage with in government, local, state, federal. Federal, like obviously has been moving GovTech for a while. There are a lot of municipalities, especially during COVID, are really starting to focus, and it's just accelerating the move to pushing these technologies to the forefront of those services, and not necessarily just the back end of a given service. So hopefully that answers the question of like, what even is GovTech? Was there any more on GovTech that we wanted to go? It looks like we got another one. What values drive equitable innovation process? How does open data play a role in that? I'll start first on that before I get into some of those responses, but a lot of them look like they're going to be echoed by me here. But reliability and efficiency, it undersold in the GovTech space right now. And if I can shed a little bit onto like the hectic back end of a government agency trying to make sure its technology works, from where we stand, for too long, the proper investment has not been made on talent and infrastructure within government to equitably and efficiently and reliably build the necessary technology for government services. And so what ends up happening too many times is we have to hobble together specific pieces of information, or just completely farm out to a third party, where then you're losing even more transparency and even more equity and even more accountability. So when we see what values drive equitable innovation, I sound like a broken record here, but centering the community in the process of innovation is honestly step number one. You see this in the private space. They talk about building everything around the user. In gov space, the whole reason for these services is for constituents. And so when you're not centering that user, not only in like, how am I thinking about this problem? Can I put myself in the shoes of the 65-year-old person living in the Bronx trying to sign up for a vaccine, but am I actually engaging and including that individual in that process, hearing their stories from their point of view, testing this piece of technology or innovation with this user, following up with them after we've tested, like had this service out for a number of months, and getting feedback throughout the process. Those are things that we really want to see more to drive equitable innovation. All right, I also see here another response, accessibility to tools, including hardwares like computers, software, like data analysis and visualization programs, focus groups and usability testings. A lot of this is stuff that I would agree with. These are things, usability testing and focus groups, I think gets a bad rap in a lot of situations, but however you want to call it, whatever you want, what name you want to put on it, having these conversations with the user and the constituent honestly will go so far in ensuring that what is ended up being deployed actually solves the problem and the pain point that the constituent has. And then this conversation has to go into not only are we solving, the problems and the inequities of the past here, but how are we now, once we get to that, breaking even point, how are we looking to the future to be progressive here? How are we looking towards the future to actually make right-sized impact? And this conversation about equitable innovation shouldn't just stop at looking to the past and getting to a break even, but more importantly, should be looking forward into the future to ensure that those same practices of equitable innovation are instilled, not from administration to administration, but instilled in the very root of how local government works. I have a question from the chat that I think I'll go into. What role do you see COPIC playing making city agencies transparent and providing accessibility to New Yorkers? So I think that specific individual has a pretty broad understanding already of what COPIC is, but for those participating that don't necessarily know too much about COPIC. COPIC is the Commission on Public Information and Communication. The public advocate himself is the chair of that commission. And that commission is very much so tasked with making sure that the information and data that public inputs and exchanges within government is accessible across all demographics. And the commission itself, unfortunately, has not lived up to its task, if we're being quite honest. It has not held robust hearings on where city agencies are being transparent. It has not put out robust engagement platforms with constituents on the accessibilities of specific services. But I really see COPIC as going hand in hand with robust open data. 100% we need open data law, 100% we need open data to ensure that there's transparency and accountability. But we, above that, need an active and third-party body, i.e. the Commission on Public Information and Communication, to ensure that, number one, open data law is being adhered to, and data that should be made public is made public through the right sources. But then being a body that is more proactive and more invested in the data that makes sure that what is actually being made open and public is accessible and usable by the end constituent. So that would be my answer to that. I know we've got just around 5 minutes left. I do want to hit on this last question I see up on the screen. What does equity and open data mean to you? And this was a question that it could go both ways. What does equity and open data mean to us as the Public Advocate's Office? Starting with that, equity and open data means that when the city and those who use and facilitate open data are going through that process, they're not just, dumping databases and putting them out there and allowing a free-for-all for whatever happens. But they're being mindful, and the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics and the whole team behind open data and groups like BetaNYC goes a long way to ensuring that the process by which data becomes open is done in an equitable way, and the use cases and education and engagement around that open data happen. So that's where I would see. But we were really interested as an office, quite honestly, to see where all of those who have been at open data throughout this week, where do you see equity in open data? Because that's something that, as the Public Advocate's Office continues its push to use open data, to use innovation, and to use technology to solve the problems facing all New Yorkers, that equity and inclusivity is at the center of those conversations. And if we're claiming that open data is a key to innovation, then the open data itself has to include a component of equity in it, and that will feed into an equitable and inclusive innovation process. Again, as I said in the beginning, kind of just quietly sitting on the sidelines for a number of years at the Public Advocate's Office, really excited that this was our first year. And definitely, as long as I'm concerned, it's not going to be our last year or the only time that our office talks about open data or innovation and technology. And I guess that's where we would end it now, is that our office is currently working on an innovation initiative, and the first iteration of this initiative is focusing on you, the constituent, and your voice and your stories around GovTech, which we've defined, the innovation process, and more broadly, just how you have engaged and interacted with government services and where technology has played a role in that story. And with the end goal of providing a framework, and as BetaNYC would call it, the people's roadmap, which is very much so the foundation for any of these conversations, but something to point to and work off of together as the Public Advocate's Office, as the organizing space, and together with New Yorkers to realize and roll out the New York that we all know is possible with technology and innovation. With that being said, I would like to thank you all for joining us for our session, Open Data, Keys to Equitable Innovation. And if there's nothing else, we'll catch you shortly.